The prison walls were thick with frost, and the cold seeped through the stones like a living thing that wanted to consume everything it touched, and in a corner of that frozen hell, a young black woman pressed her body against a wounded American soldier, trying to share what little warmth she had because the Germans had taken their blankets and their coats and their hope, but they could not take the heat that lived inside her, and she would give every degree of it before she let another man die in this place. Her name was Josephine Louise Carter, and she had been born in 1922 in the Treem neighborhood of New Orleans, where the music never stopped and the gumbo always simmered on someone's stove, and the people who looked like her had built a culture so rich and beautiful that it had become the soul of a city. And Josephine had grown up dreaming of becoming a singer like the women she heard on her grandmother's radio, but God had other plans for her, and those plans would take her farther from home than she ever imagined possible. She had been working as a volunteer with the American Red Cross when the war came, and she had trained as a nurse. Essayed because she wanted to do more than roll bandages and write letters, and she had pushed against every barrier that tried to keep black women in safe positions far from the fighting, because safety meant nothing to her when American boys were dying overseas, and she believed with every fiber of her being that her hands could make a difference, if only someone would let her use them. But what happened next changed everything, because in 1944 the Red Cross began sending more personnel to support the advancing Allied forces in Europe, and Josephine was assigned to a hospital unit in France, and she crossed the Atlantic on a ship crowded with soldiers who looked at her with curiosity and sometimes hostility, and she ignored their stares and focused on what waited ahead, because the past was behind her and the future was all that mattered now. The hospital in France was chaos made permanent, and Josephine worked 18-hour shifts treating wounds that ranged from minor to catastrophic, and she learned quickly that war did not discriminate in the damage it caused, and that a bullet did not care about the color of the body it entered, and she treated German prisoners with the same care she gave American soldiers, because suffering was universal and compassion could not have boundaries, or it was not compassion at all. Yet, she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny, because on a December morning in 1944, during the massive German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, enemy forces overran the American positions near the hospital, and Josephine found herself hiding in a basement with 23 wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated, and the sound of German boots on the floor above them was the sound of everything she feared. They found her 2 hours later when a German sergeant pulled open the basement door and pointed his rifle down the stairs, and Josephine stood up slowly with her hands raised and her Red Cross armband clearly visible, and she said in the only German words she knew that there were wounded men here, and that she was a medical worker. And the sergeant stared at her for a long moment, because he had never seen a black woman before, and he did not know what to make of her presence. And then, something no one expected, because the German sergeant lowered his rifle and called to his commanding officer, and an SS captain came down the stairs and looked at Josephine and looked at the wounded Americans, and he made a decision that went against everything the Nazi ideology taught, and he ordered that the wounded be transported to a prisoner of war camp, and that the woman who had been caring for them would go with them to continue her work. The journey to the prison camp took 3 days in open trucks, through snow that fell without stopping, and Josephine huddled with the wounded soldiers and tried to keep them warm with nothing but their shared body heat, and 2 of them died along the way, and she held their hands as they passed and whispered prayers in their ears and promised them that she would tell their families they had been brave, and she meant every word, even though she had no idea if she would ever see America again. Behind these ruins a secret waited, because the camp they arrived at was not a standard prisoner of war facility, but something darker and more dangerous, and Josephine saw the skeletal figures in striped uniforms working in the fields beyond the fence, and she understood that this place held secrets that the world was not yet ready to know, and the knowledge settled into her bones like the cold, and she knew she would carry it forever. The camp commandant was a man named Hauptmann Werner Dietrich, who had been a professor of literature before the war, and who had somehow found himself running a facility that he privately despised. And when he saw Josephine arrive with the American prisoners, he made a calculation that was equal parts practical and humane, and he assigned her to the camp infirmary, where her medical training could be used to keep the prisoners alive long enough to be useful as workers. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders, because the infirmary was filled not only with wounded American soldiers, but with prisoners from a dozen different nations, and with people who wore the yellow stars and the pink triangles and the other markers that the Nazi regime used to categorize those it considered less than human, and Josephine realized that she had been placed at the intersection of all the war's horrors, and that her presence, there was either a curse or an opportunity. She chose to see it as an opportunity, and she began treating everyone who came to the infirmary, regardless of what symbol they wore or what language they spoke, and she shared the meager medical supplies equally, and she sat with the dying and sang the songs her grandmother had taught her, and the sound of her voice carrying through the cold barracks became a kind of medicine that no pharmaceutical company could manufacture. The American soldiers she had arrived with became her family, and she protected them with a ferocity that surprised even herself. And when the gods tried to take men who were too weak to work to a place from which no one returned, she stood in front of them and insisted that they needed more time to heal, and sometimes her insistence worked, and sometimes it did not. But she never stopped trying, because trying was all she had left. There was a young private from Alabama named Samuel Jackson who had been shot in the leg during the ambush, and whose wound had become infected during the journey to the camp, and the doctors said he would lose the leg and probably his life, but Josephine refused to accept that verdict. And she cleaned his wound every day with water. She boiled over a small fire, and she changed his bandages with strips torn from her own clothing, and she talked to him through the fever dreams and told him about New Orleans and the music and the food and the way the light looked on the Mississippi in the morning. Samuel survived, and his leg healed, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he would walk, and every step he took was a testament to the woman who had refused to let him die. And he told anyone who would listen that Josephine Carter had saved him not with medicine alone, but with a stubborn love that the Germans could not kill no matter how hard they tried. The winter of 1944 became the spring of 1945, and the war was turning, and everyone in the camp could feel it. And the way the guards grew nervous, and the radio announcements became fewer, and the rations became even more scarce, and Josine watched and waited and prepared the wounded for what she hoped would be liberation, and what she feared might be something much worse. The Commandant Monday Drake called her to his office one evening in March, and she walked through the camp with her heart pounding, because a summons to the commandant's office often meant execution, and she prepared herself to die with the same dignity she had tried to live. But when she entered his office, he was not holding a gun. He was holding a bottle of wine, and he poured 2 glasses and told her to sit. He told her that he had watched her for months, and that he had seen her treat Jewish prisoners with the same care she gave American soldiers, and that her compassion had reminded him of the person he used to be before the war, before the ideology, before the uniform. And he told her that the Russians were coming from the east, and the Americans from the west, and that soon this camp would be liberated or destroyed. And he wanted her to know that he had tried in his small way to make things less terrible. Josephine drank the wine and listened, and she did not forgive him, because forgiveness was not hers to give, but she understood that even in the darkness there were people who struggled to hold onto something human, and she told him that history would remember what had happened here, and that the only thing any of them could do now was try to save as many lives as possible before the end came. The liberation came in April, when American tanks rolled through the gates, and the soldiers who emerged from those vehicles were unprepared for what they found, and Josephine was there to meet them, standing in front of the infirmary with her Red Cross armband faded but still visible, and she guided them through the camp and showed them where the bodies were buried and where the survivors needed help, and she became the bridge between the liberators and the liberated. The commanding officer of the American unit was a colonel from Ohio who had seen combat across Europe, but who wept openly when he saw the conditions in the camp, and he asked Josephine how long she had been there, and she told him for months, and he asked her how she had survived, and she told him that she had not survived, she had simply refused to die. And there was a difference, and he nodded because he understood exactly what she meant. The days after liberation were chaos of a different kind, and Josephine continued to work in the infirmary, treating survivors who were too weak to travel and soldiers who had been wounded in the final fighting, and she did not sleep for 3 days, because every time she closed her eyes she saw the faces of those she had not been able to save, and the guilt was a weight that threatened to crush her. She was evacuated to a hospital in Paris, where she was supposed to rest and recover, but she could not rest, because there was still work to be done, and she volunteered at a refugee center helping displaced persons find their families, and she worked there until the war ended and beyond. Because the end of fighting was not the end of suffering, and she knew that as long as there was suffering, there would be a need for compassion. The army wanted to give her a medal, but the regulations at the time did not allow for combat decorations to be given to Red Cross volunteers, especially black women who were not supposed to be anywhere near combat. and sore heroism was recorded in reports that were filed away and forgotten, and she returned to America without the recognition she deserved, but with memories that would never fade. She came home to a new Orleans that had changed and that had not changed because the music still played and the gumbo still simmered, but the signs that said colored only still hung above water fountains and bus stations, and Josephine felt a rage building inside her that she had not felt even in the prison camp, because she had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom, and she had come home to find that freedom was still not hers to claim. She channeled that rage into action, and she became a civil rights activist who marched and organized and spoke at churches and community centers, and she told people about what she had seen in Europe and about what America could become if it had the courage to live up to its ideals, and her voice, which had once sung lullabies to dying men, now sang a different song, and that song was the sound of change coming. The years turned into decades, and Josephine watched her country transform slowly and painfully, and she saw laws change and attitudes shift, and she lived long enough to vote for a black president, and she wept that night, not because she had never believed it was possible, but because she had always believed, and finally the world had caught up with her faith. Samuel Jackson visited her every year on the anniversary of their liberation, and they would sit on her porch and drink sweet tea and remember the soldiers who had not survived, and the ones who had, and the bond between them was stronger than any medal or any official recognition, because they had walked through fire together, and fire either destroys you or forges you into something unbreakable. The researcher who discovered her story in 2010 was a young black woman from New York who had been looking for something else in the National Archives and had found Josephine's name in a declassified report about prisoner treatment, and she had followed the thread and found the witnesses and pieced together a story that should have been told decades earlier, and she tracked down Josephine, who was 98 years old and still sharp as the needles she had used to stitch wounds in a frozen prison camp. The recognition finally came in 2012, when the Secretary of the Army presented Josephine with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House, and she sat in her wheelchair with Samuel Jackson beside her, and she accepted the medal with the same grace she had shown in every moment of her extraordinary life, and she told the assembled dignitaries that she had not done anything special, she had simply done what needed to be done, and that anyone would have done the same. But we know that is not true, because not everyone would have done what Josephine Carter did, and not everyone would have risked their life to protect strangers. And not everyone would have sung lullabies in a frozen prison camp, and not everyone would have fought for justice for 50 years after the war ended, and her humility was just another form of her courage, and we honor her not because she claims to be special, but because she proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Josephine Louise Carter passed away in 2015 at the age of 93. And a funeral in New Orleans was attended by hundreds of people, including veterans and civil rights leaders and ordinary citizens who had heard her story and wanted to pay their respects, and the jazz band that led her procession played all her favorite songs, and the music echoed through the streets of Treem, where she had been born 93 years before. Her story reminds us that the greatest generation included people whose names were never written in the history books, and whose contributions were minimized or ignored because of the color of their skin, and Josephine Carter was one of countless black Americans who served during World War II and who came home to fight another war for their own dignity, and her emergence from obscurity is a reminder that history is never complete. The prison camp where she spent those frozen months was demolished after the war, and the land was returned to forest, and today there is nothing there but trees and silence. But the spirits of those who suffered and died in that place remain, and Josephine's spirit is among them, caring for them still, as she did in life, because some bonds cannot be broken, not by time, not by death, not by anything the world can devise. And so we remember Josephine Louise Carter not as a victim of war or racism, but as a victor over everything that tried to diminish her, and we remember her not because she sought glory, but because she sought only to serve, and in serving she proved that love is stronger than hate, and that one person with a caring heart can illuminate even the darkest corner of human experience. The cold that tried to kill her in that prison camp never left her body entirely, and she felt it in her bones on winter nights for the rest of her life, but she never complained, because the cold was a reminder that she had survived, and that survival meant she had work still to do, and she did that work until her final breath and left the world better than she found it. And that is all any of us can hope to do. She sang lullabies to dying soldiers in a German prison camp, and she sang freedom songs on the streets of New Orleans, and she sang happy birthday to a great-grandchild who would never know the horrors she had witnessed, and her voice carried through time, connecting past and present and future in a melody that will never end. Because love does not end, and compassion does not end. And Josephine Louise Carter does not end, she simply transforms.